Welcome to the Cinderella post-reading discussion. Cinderella is arguably the most famous fairy tale in the world, and when we trace its origins and try to find the very first Cinderella story, we find that it might be the oldest fairy tale in the world. We can go back as far as ancient Greece, around 2 BC, and find a story of Rhodopis, who is a girl whose sandal is taken by an eagle, and that eagle flies off and drops it in the lap of a king. And the king, who is a little bit bemused by the fact that an eagle dropped a sandal in his lap, and B, sees that the sandal is dainty and beautiful, seeks out the owner of the sandal, and when he finds her, marries her. If you insist that a Cinderella story has to also include the component of a stepmother who abuses her stepdaughter, then we go back to 850 ancient China with the story of Ye Shen, where the fairy godmother is actually a fish who is sort of the embodiment of her dead mother. So either way, you have the story that has spanned centuries and has spanned cultures, and it doesn't show any signs of stopping. Disney released its live action version of Cinderella only a few years ago, and currently there is a musical version in production that is set to be released, I believe, sometime next year. So what is it about this story that makes it resonate across cultures and across time? I think that there are a few things that make this story so popular. First and foremost is the fact that it is the quintessential rags to riches story, and everybody loves a good rags to riches story. Now, the idea of reversal of fortune shows up in many fairy tales, and it is something that makes them very popular. People like to read stories about someone who is down on their luck, but because they are a good person, they are able to then be rewarded for that and enter into this life of luxury. In fact, the American dream itself is essentially a rags to riches story, that if you're a good person and you work hard, then you will be rewarded. And then there are a couple of other things that show up in several fairy tales that show up in Cinderella that make it really popular. And one of them is the presence of the stepmother. Now, this showed up in the juniper tree, and I said I would talk about stepmothers in a later video, and this is that video. So, one of the reasons that people, particularly people who are looking at fairy tales from a psychological lens, believe that stepmothers show up in fairy tales is it is a way for children to explore that necessary clash between child and parent that has to happen for them to sort of come of age and become adults themselves. But it is a safe way to explore that clash without it being the actual mother. So what you have in stories like Cinderella is you have the mother figure embodied by two different characters. You have the positive aspects of a mother, or what children view as the positive aspects of a mother, the nurturing, good, caring person in the guise of the biological mother who then dies, right? And then the stepmother embodies that that clash, right? That part of the mother, or really parents in general, where the child has to have that clash, has to have some enmity there in order to come of age and develop into an independent person who no longer is, attached to their mother's apron strings, as it were. And so by supplanting the mother with a stepmother, that makes it sort of easier for children to sort of explore that idea without feeling guilty about, having negative feelings about their own actual parents. So that's what a lot of psychological sort of interpretations of fairy tales will talk about in terms of why stepmothers are so prevalent. However, I think stepmothers are also prevalent in fairy tales because at the time that they were starting to be told, it was not uncommon for women to die in childbirth and for men then to marry another wife. So having a stepmother was maybe a little bit more common as well in the Middle Ages when some of these oral tales were starting to be spun. We'll talk about stepmothers a little bit more when we talk about Snow White, but in general, stepmothers are there as this villain, as this mother, but not really a mother. They're sort of free to do more evil things. They're supposed to be motherly. They're supposed to be nurturing, but they're not the real mother, and so they don't act like a real mother. And it sets the stage for that clash and the need for the hero or heroine to separate from their parents. And separation from parents is another huge trope that you find in fairy tales. Almost every fairy tale, you're going to find that the main character is separated from their parents either by death or by like a little literal physical separation. Like, Hansel and Gretel are sent out into the woods and physically separated from the parents. That has to happen for the child to become independent and to go through that cycle of blossoming into adulthood. The other thing is you have the stepsisters, and the stepsisters are there as a way for, again, this is looking at it through a psychological lens, for children to explore the ideas of sibling rivalry, which is very common among kids who have siblings. And so it's a way for them to sort of think about and cycle through their ideas about sibling rivalry, again, in a safe way. So I think those are some of the reasons why Cinderella is so popular. Now, I want to talk about these two versions that I read specifically and the differences between the two. You will have noticed there are some really stark differences between the two stories. And one of the things to keep in mind when you're looking at Perrault and the Grimms is that they are writing for very different audiences. Perrault was writing for French aristocracy, and you see this especially in his version of Cinderella, because he has specifics in there like the parquet flooring and the Honiton lace, and talking about all of these different fashions and things that would be very interesting to members of the French court, right? So that's who his audience is. He also very much intended his tales to bestow like morality onto his readers. In fact, Perrault has an explicit moral that he includes at the end of each tale, and I read it when I read his version, where he's trying to give some lesson to his readers, and usually his lesson is for girls, at least in some of the stories that I'm going to be reading. And certainly in Cinderella, and the lesson is, the way to get the prince is to be kind and gentle. You have to be a well-behaved woman in order to get a prince. The Grimms also try to imbue sort of some morality in their tales, but keep in mind that their audience is just the commoners of Germany, sort of Germany at large. And they might have slightly different ideas of what morality they want to bestow upon their readers. Now, both stories make a big fuss about Cinderella being a good person, right? It's very important that she is virtuous, that she is pious. The Grimms specifically say pious, and her mother says, if you are pious, then God will look out for you, and I will look out for you. So certainly there is this, you need to be well behaved. But there's a little bit different focus between the two. For Perrault, one of the lessons is that Cinderella is good, her stepsisters are bad, and part of what makes her stepsisters bad, besides the fact that they mistreat her, is that they are vain. They're always looking in the mirror, and they have floor-length mirrors at a time when not everyone could afford a mirror at all. So they're always looking in the mirror, they're not eating, they're drawing their stays tight to make their waists slender. And vanity is very much something that is punished in women or is shown to be a bad thing in women in fairy tales, and especially in Perrault's version of Cinderella. But it's really interesting to note that it's good to be good looking. You just don't want to care about it or try. So Cinderella, right, is described as being even more beautiful than her stepsisters. But the difference is she doesn't try. And it's like that terrible, terrible song that says, you know, you don't know you're beautiful and that's what makes you beautiful, right? Because a woman is still expected to be beautiful, but heaven forbid that she A, realizes that she's beautiful, or B, tries to be beautiful. Now with the Grimms, there's not as much emphasis on the vanity. I mean, it's there, but it's not as much. It's much more that they are cruel, and the stepsisters are punished for it. They're not punished in the Perrault version, and I think that is something that modern audiences don't like, because I cannot think of a single film version of Cinderella where the stepsisters get forgiven and then married off to members of the court like they are in the Perrault version. The Perrault version is the one that most modern film versions take from. It's what Disney based theirs on. It's the one that has the pumpkin and the glass slipper and the fairy godmother and the mice that get turned into horses, and the condition of getting home by midnight. That's all Perrault. None of that shows up in the Grimms. And so that's what we're used to, but nobody that I'm aware of keeps the Perrault ending of forgiving the stepsisters and marrying them off to members of the court. It's almost like they're rewarded in a way. That's not palatable to modern audiences. At best, the stepsisters are, sort of just forgotten at the end of films, but usually they are punished, and they are punished in the Grimm version, which I think is something that is more, again, palatable to modern audiences. We expect that the villain is punished. We expect justice to be served. Now, one of the problems that you might have with the Grimm version is that the punishment is violent and gory, but at least it's there, right? At least there is that lesson. The lesson isn't only centered on Cinderella and the fact that being a good person is rewarded, but also on the fact that being wicked is going to be punished. So that's one of the differences, is how the stepsisters are treated, and again, taking a look at the audiences. The other big difference is obviously the presence of the fairy godmother in the Perrault version, and the fact that there is no fairy godmother in the Grimm version, unless you say that the birds in the hazel tree are sort of like a fairy god or godmother. They're like imbued maybe with the spirit of her dead mother. But that's very different, I think, than an actual fairy godmother. And talking about the fairy godmother, we're led to think back on Cinderella's interaction with the fairy godmother and how Cinderella gets to the ball to begin with. And that is where I think the most important difference is between the two versions. And before I get to that, I want to talk about how the Perrault version is, again, the most well-known one because it's the one that Disney took from, and that has led to Cinderella sort of getting a bad rap in modern culture, right? You have the Cinderella complex and the Cinderella effect. These are both sociological ideas that are named for Cinderella's story, and they're both bad things. You have the book Cinderella Ate My Daughter, which talks about how Disney princesses and then other things in our culture sort of are ruining girls in terms of where their priorities are and what their self-esteem is like. And there's this idea of Cinderella as this incredibly weak character She just waits around for a prince. She is judged based only on her looks, and she has nothing else going for her. She's a pushover. And so there's kind of this very, negative view of Cinderella now that we are living in sort of a more feminist society. And I get that because people are talking about the Perrault version. Because what happens in the Perrault version? Cinderella is upset that she can't go to the ball, so she starts crying. And then her fairy godmother shows up. Now, we are given no indication that she has ever spoken with this person before, or who this fairy godmother is, where she came from. Just poof, she appears, and Cinderella can't even vocalize to her what she wants. She's crying so hard, and the godmother has to say, "You want to go to the ball, right?" And Cinderella snivels like, "Yes." And then the godmother gives her everything, and she goes off to the ball. And even though Perrault makes this big deal about her being a really great person, she's still kind of, I don't think she is, right? When she comes back and the sisters are talking about the girl at the ball, right? And Cinderella does that little underhanded, "Oh, she must have been very beautiful," just so she can hear her stepsisters say how beautiful she was. I feel like that's kind of shady, and that's maybe not in character with, the super good girl that Perrault paints her to be. Same thing when she asks to borrow the dress, and then it says no, she'd be embarrassed to wear that dress. Really? Because before she was just the servant dressed in rags, and now, after one night of going to the ball in the dress that her fairy godmother gave her, she'd be embarrassed to wear this other dress. I don't know. I don't think that's a great role model. Or in keeping with this idea that Perrault has of her being this incredibly good, pious person, even if she does forgive her stepsisters at the end. So I understand why Cinderella gets a bad rap based on the Perrault version, but I don't think you can make that same argument for the Grimm Cinderella. The Grimm Cinderella exercises agency. When she decides she wants to go to the ball, she uses the resources that she has to make that happen. First, her stepmother says, "Well, pick these lentils out of the ashes," and she says, "Well, I know how to fix that. I have these birds that will help me out. I'm going to go call these birds." And they do. And then when her stepmother says, "JK, you can't come." "Okay, I'm going to go to the hazel tree and ask it to ask these birds to give me a dress to wear because I am going to the ball." So Cinderella makes it happen. She takes action. And in both versions, she's not going to the ball because she wants to get a prince. We sort of have this idea of Cinderella just, her goal being to one day marry a prince. And that's not her motivation in either story. Her motivation is she wants to have a night of fun for once in her life. And I think particularly in the Grimm version, I can really get behind Cinderella, just wanting to go out, have a good time. And she doesn't have that midnight restriction. She leaves the ball because she's done dancing. Okay, I've had my fun. I'm ready to go home and go to bed. And the prince wants to follow her, and she doesn't want the prince to follow her. She doesn't necessarily want anything to do with him. She just came to have a good time. She's done. She's going to go home and, rest. But he follows her, and she's able to, outwit him, outrun him. And then the exchange between the father and the prince is sort of entertaining because they're kind of dumb, right? At first you're like, how is the prince getting tricked by this girl all the time? He doesn't see that she gets down the other side of the tree. Okay. And then the father, could it be Aschenputtel? No, it couldn't be Aschenputtel. Really? Who else do you think is going to your house in the middle of the night after the ball? Right. And, we can talk about the father in just a second, but Cinderella is a woman of her own agency. And there's a lot to be said about the Grimms, and many of their stories are still certainly not anything that we would consider necessarily progressive, and especially when we look at things like Little Red Riding Hood. But I think that their Cinderella is a little bit ahead of its time in terms of having a female lead who exercises agency over her own life in some way. Now, to talk about the fathers, that's another thing that is not very palatable to modern audiences. In pretty much every film version that you're going to see of Cinderella, the father gets killed off because keeping the father around, which Perrault and the Grimms both did, causes problems for the modern reader, right? Perrault specifically says that the father was ruled by his wife, right? So he's henpecked and he allows this abuse to happen. And it's the same thing with the father in the Grimm version, even though the Grimms don't have that, specific line. Obviously, he's still around because he's the one who's saying, well, could it be Aschenputtel? And at first you think, oh, well, he's just clearly a dolt who doesn't know what's going on, maybe. Until you get to the end where he has that line that says, oh, my dead wife left behind this stunted Cinderella. And you just think, wait, that's your biological daughter and you're calling her like a stunted Cinderella. What kind of father are you? And so the fathers in Cinderella in the original versions, certainly very problematic for modern day audiences, and that's why they get killed off. It's much easier to believe that the stepmother is able to hold this power over Cinderella if she is the only authority figure in the house. So that's another difference between the stories and as they actually are written, and then how they have come to be changed for modern audiences, particularly with film versions. Now, the other thing that you may have noticed as a difference between the two stories is the slipper itself. And, everybody thinks glass slipper because that's the Perrault version, and they don't realize that the slipper is gold in the Grimm version. Now, when we're talking about the slipper, we're going to have some adult conversation here. I did a research paper in grad school about footwear and feet and dancing in fairy tales. They show up a lot. If you have been with me from the beginning and you've read Juniper Tree, right? There are a pair of shoes that show up in that, and pretty soon I'm going to be doing Snow White, and there are shoes in that, and there are going to be some other tales where footwear shows up, or dancing shows up, or both footwear and dancing shows up. And when we're talking about the slipper for Cinderella, there are a few things to mention. First, for a while there was some theory that Perrault originally meant for it to be a fur slipper. And the reason that people thought that is that the word for glass and the word for fur in French, they're homonyms, so they sound the same but are spelled differently. And that theory has since been debunked. Experts agree that he really did mean a glass slipper, partly because that would have been very fashionable. Like his audience, again, at the court, glass blowing was sort of becoming really popular at that time. And, just that idea would have really captivated his audience specifically. But one of the reasons why people might have thought it was a fur slipper, besides the fact that, fur, ver and ver, and in French, it's two different spellings of the word ver, is that the image of a foot being inserted into a slipper is intentional and it has certain implications. And that's, and so if you think about a foot being inserted into a fur slipper, what does that sort of connote? Now, just because it wasn't actually a fur slipper and it was a glass slipper, that doesn't completely negate the idea that the slipper is more than just a literal shoe, right? The fact that it's glass and the fact that it's gold are important because those are both substances that are associated with purity. And it's important, right, that Cinderella is pure, right? She's a good girl. And so the shoe represents her purity, and the fact that the prince has taken ownership of it and he is using it to then take ownership of the girl and her purity by marrying her, right? That's not an accident. It's also not an accident that it's a shoe, because there is this history of shoes being related to business exchanges and marriage. So as far back as the ancient Hebrews and ancient Egyptians, shoes were used, or sandals were used to sort of seal a deal with business. Throwing your sandal onto a piece of land was a way of showing that you claimed it. In Egypt, weddings were sort of finalized by the father of the bride giving her sandal to the groom as a way of showing that the groom now had ownership of her. In Anglo-Saxon tradition, weddings also included shoes as part of the sort of the wedding rites or ceremonies to show kind of like ownership of the woman being passed from father to son. That is why eventually we sort of end up with this tradition of tying shoes to the back of a bumper. So they are associated with business deals, and they are associated specifically with marriage. Also, you can talk about the glass slipper representing purity, and think about the glass in Jewish weddings. Now, the breaking of the glass in Jewish weddings has several different interpretations that people have made of it. It could symbolize several different things, but one of the things that it can symbolize is the breaking of the hymen that will occur as a consummation of the marriage. And so when you think about that, and you think about, the history of shoes as they are related to ownership, as they are related to marriage, when you think about the long history of foot fetishes and the way that shoes and feet are tied to sexuality as well, it's not a stretch when you start to think about what the shoe can represent or symbolize in the stories of Cinderella. Trust me, I did not think when I first started researching for my paper that I would end up learning about 18th century French pornographers and the word retifism, but I did, and it's not a stretch, right? There's a lot of work that has been done about this subject, and footwear and fairy tales can actually mean a lot of different things. In many tales, it also is a symbol of status. And certainly the fact of like a glass or a gold slipper, not only are those materials that are representative of purity, they're also materials that are very expensive. Gold, we understand. Glass, you have to think about the time when it was originally written and how expensive a glass slipper would actually be at the time, right? And so again, it's something that is going to sort of bestow a sort of status on Cinderella, indicating that even though her current situation is that she is a peasant, or really a slave to her stepmother, that her character, the fact that she is a good person, and her future, the foreshadowing that she is going to marry a prince, indicate that she is actually a person of status, a person who is deserving of one of these expensive shoes. So that's some of my discussion of the difference between the two stories and sort of Cinderella in general. I want to close by talking about one of my favorite Cinderella movies that I would like to recommend to you. It's not very well known. You might be familiar with some of the more modern versions like Ever After and Ella Enchanted. And actually, there are a lot of Cinderella movies that aren't explicitly Cinderella. Like Pretty Woman, that's a Cinderella story, right? But in the movie Ever After, the Cinderella meets the prince ahead of time, and they have this like ongoing relationship before the ball even happens. But you might not know that that's not the first movie where that idea comes about. And I don't know if this is the first movie where this comes about, but it's certainly much older. It's from 1955. It's called The Glass Slipper, and it stars Leslie Caron, who you might know from Gigi or Lily. And what I like about this movie, there's actually a few things that I like about this movie. One of the things is that her Cinderella, she meets the prince before the ball, and she doesn't know that he's the prince. He tells her that he's the son of the cook at the palace. And they kind of hang out, and he teaches her some of the dances that would be at the ball if she's able to come. And he so hopes that she can come. He procured her an invite by cooking a delicious dish for the king, so he says. So I like that idea, obviously. But I really like that Cinderella is not this super goody-goody. She's actually considered kind of a brat by the people in the town because she pushes back a little bit at her stepmother and her stepsisters, and she doesn't take their abuse sitting down necessarily, and people tease her and she will try to fight back a little bit. And so I really like that about her character. And I also like that she's not conventionally pretty. It's really sort of more her attitude that the prince is attracted to. I mean, I'm not saying she's ugly, but it really is more of kind of her personality a little bit than just her looks. And the other thing that I really like about this version is her fairy godmother, who is played by Estelle Winwood. And if you are an MST3K fan, you know how great Estelle Winwood is. She plays her fairy godmother, and her fairy godmother is this woman that everybody knows from the town and everybody thinks is a nut. They tolerate her because she's harmless, but they think she's kind of crazy. And one of the lines that I still think is hilarious is the stepmother, when she's talking about the Mrs. Touquet, that's the name of the fairy godmother, says, she used to be like a normal, fashionable woman, but then she took to reading books and she went from bad to worse. It's fantastic, right? I mean, it's 1955, it's not an uber feminist film, but there's certainly like those little elements to it, right? Where it's the fact that this woman reads that makes her this outsider. And she goes around and she talks about what her favorite words are, and she pontificates about like different philosophical ideas, and she really is fun. Her interactions with Cinderella, and again, she, unlike the Perrault version where the fairy godmother just poof appears when Cinderella wants to go to the ball, Cinderella and her fairy godmother meet beforehand and develop a friendship. And there's actually sort of an ambiguity as to whether her fairy godmother is magic or not. And I like that as well. So I would highly recommend that you check it out if you get the chance. I don't know if it's available on different platforms, but search it out, see if you can find it, and definitely give it a watch. That's actually, I think, what I'm going to do right now. So until next time, I wish you a very happily ever after.